So we're just letting folks in. And I see I've got a thumbs up from Jonathan that we're live. So we're gonna dive in. Welcome everybody. I wish I had a moment to say hi to all of your lovely faces, but we've got a lot of excellent content to cover today. So we're gonna dive right in. I just wanna kick us off by saying we've been hosting these conversations about growth and planning in our community for the past several years, and we're online. So the conversations are recorded. We're sharing them through social media and YouTube. If you miss something real time, you can always watch later or share it with your friends. We've got an hour for our conversation today. So I'm going to do a quick introduction and then pass it over to our speakers so we have time for questions at the end. My name's Michelle Ubaraga. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director for Park County Environmental Council. We are your community conservation group. So our job is to work with people here in Park County to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and community in Yellowstone's Northern Gateway. We do that through grassroots advocacy and organizing. The purpose of these conversations is to create more understanding and a shared language around all the tools that our community can utilize to protect our open lands, the Yellowstone River, wildlife habitat, and our way of life, all the things we treasure. And there's a lot happening right now in our community. We have been seeing more and more people retreating to gateway communities like ours to live near natural amenities, public lands, the Yellowstone River, Yellowstone National Park. And this trend, as many of you know, has been happening for years. But with the pandemic, we're certainly seeing an increase in residents across Southwest Montana at remarkable rates. And growth at the current rate can lead to problems that are traditionally thought of as city issues, urban issues, like lack of affordable housing, availability of public transit, congestion, income inequality. We're already starting to see some of those issues and ready to tackle them. So now more than ever, it's really imperative that we're working together at the local level to make sure that we avoid those challenges and we set out a vision for how we want to grow in a way that maintains our unique character, doesn't overly burden taxpayers, and protects our way of life. So this is our fourth conversation related to planning. The previous ones we did on conservation easements, about the Livingston growth policy, and about the really expansive future growth maps we saw in that growth policy that didn't really line up with our community values. We were pretty clear that sprawl was not something that this community wanted to see. And the conversations led to, well, if we don't want this big increase in our footprint in sprawl, how do we focus on our downtown? And that's what led us to this conversation today and to inviting this excellent organization, Strong Towns, to share some ideas with us. I want to just do a quick reminder that if you have comments, I want to thank everybody for submitting incredible amount of comments and participation in the Livingston growth policy. I think there were almost 60 people at the last growth policy hearing with excellent comments. So thank you all. Let's keep doing that. As a result, I really am confident that the planning board is going to take the time to hear your thoughts and incorporate and make our growth policy reflect our vision. So thank you for that. And just reminder to continue to do that, and that to send them to those folks. If you need help with that, let us know. But don't send your comments to us, send them to the city and to the planning board. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jen to introduce our speakers. Thank you all.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Michelle, if I counted right, I think this is our 10th community conversation. We started a little over a year ago, just having these conversations about a variety of issues related to planning. And planning, of course, is so broad that we've been able to kind of plug in a variety of different topics, including today. And I really welcome Strong Towns and John Reuter to Livingston. Wish you were here in person, but this is the next best thing. I have been paying attention to Strong Towns for the past couple of years. They've got a great website, great programs, articles, podcasts, and courses such as today. And as John showed us earlier, a book from their founder on kind of their bottom-up revolution concept. So after today, I really recommend going to their website and kind of just seeing the wealth of information that they have. So John Reuter, welcome. He is originally from Idaho. If I understand your bio, you have your family has a background in the sheep industry, which is a badge of honor in these parts. You're currently living in Seattle, so you can relate to some of our dreary weather here. But I'll pass it off to you, John. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And it is such a joy to speak with all of you. I was just saying to our hosts here before we all came in together, how excited I was to speak with all of you, because it just matches up with how I got started in all of this work and concerned about these issues. So beyond being part of Strong Towns and helping think about in a broad way how we make cities and towns and communities across the country stronger and more fiscally resilient, particularly, I got my start actually during a comprehensive planning process in a little town in North Idaho called Sandpoint, Idaho, about 6,000 to 8,000 people, so very similar in size, a community that was experiencing a lot of growth pressures because we had Schweitzer Mountain Ski Resort and this large lake right nearby. And so really it just been being discovered, and we were having all this like influx of people, and there was this whole conversation of how we grow and this whole debate about what's that growth going to be like and what's going to happen there. And that had led to me ending up on the city council and ultimately helping write that strategic plan and really doing a lot of work of figuring out how we could engage the community more deeply and make sure that community values actually were centered in that plan in a much deeper way. And that we started to have those questions, and it made me start to think about a lot of the questions we're going to talk about today. So I'm just thrilled to talk with you all because it feels your interest in this and what brings you to this conversation is very similar to what brought me to this conversation and why I'm here too and why I'm passionate about this work. And I'm just very excited for us to have this dialogue and today. So a little bit more about Strong Towns here just briefly. As I mentioned, right, we're about supporting the model of development that allows America's cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. We really look at the financial side of the equation and look at one of our slogans is do the math. And so it's really about saying, like, how does this actually financially pencil out? And we found specifically in rural communities, it's very useful to say what kind of community do you want to be, talking about livability, talking about quality of life, having those conversations. But it's also, we found really important to talk about the actual issues of budgets and city budgets and the community and economic development and long-term what's going to go there. And so today I'm going to really focus on that budget side of things. And what the impacts are of patterns of growth and how they relate to budgets, and a lot of the research that we've done over the years that looks at those kind of things. I want to plant this question in your head before I go into the actual talk proper here, which are, what are the impacts of growth? And I think in my experience, oftentimes people have really gut reaction to the impacts of growth. And they're either really fiercely and ideologically positive or really fiercely and ideologically negative. Growth destroys us. It makes us lose our small town character. It takes away the things that we care about. Or alternatively, growth is the only way we're going to survive. We'll lose everything we care about. We won't be a town anymore if we don't grow. And what I want to posit here is growth does not lead to one set of inevitable outcomes. Growth creates choices. And some of those choices will lead to wealth and prosperity and long-term create a stronger, more connected community. And other choices will actually make the community poorer. That even as new money pours in, it will actually make your city have less wealth and have less strength and become actually less resilient and more fragile and could long-term lead to bankruptcy. And so the real question with growth is not to understand it as good or bad, but to understand it as an opportunity to make smart decisions. So that's the context I want to just put on this overall talk here for the moment that you're in here. And with that, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go way, way back. And I'm going to go back to Rome which is in this lower corner here is Rome. And then up here is the ancient city of I like to say that is the sister city of That's not true, but it's something I like to, well, it could be true. We don't know all the cities that were back then, right? There were all these cities popping up back at thousands and thousands of years ago. And some of them, like and disappeared, and others of them slowly over time built up and became Rome, became these grand cities. What these cities have in common with each other, despite their very different scale and size, is they both were built for the most advanced technology that existed at that time. And what was that? The transportation technology at the time? It was to walk around on your own 2 feet, right? They were both built at that pedestrian scale for people to get around, and that was that highest level of technology. And we kept building things. This is Brainerd, Minnesota, where our organization was founded. And right, this is the same, this street is thousands of years in the future, but is still built at that same scale. I mean, there's horses and carriages there, but still essentially this is built for people to get around by walking and transporting in this kind of way. And that's really what we did for thousands and thousands of years. We built cities in this incremental way around people being able to walk, around having things being this walkable way, until we got to this point around World War II, where we started building cities in this different way, right? We started to build them, and the pattern of development started to really change. And if you talk to the people at the time who were building this new pattern of development, right, they would tell you that we're building it for cars now, right? And just like the development, this is what progress looks like. Just like in the past, we built things for people to walk around because that was the most advanced form of way to get around. Now we have automobiles, and now we build for automobiles to get around. Someday we're going to have jetpacks, and we'll build cities so you can zoom around on your jetpacks. Someday maybe we'll have instant transportation, and so we'll have cities built for instant transportation. And this is just how progress works. Is we build for the new technology that we have, we build for where we're at, and this is progress, this is movement, this is how things happen and change and grow. But the other idea I want to plant for you here is, this was a really radical experiment. The other way to look at this is, for thousands of years, we built cities in the same way, and in the same method, into that same kind of mode of transportation and thinking. And even though we increased and we had rail travel, and we even had some, locomotion, we had carriages, we had other kinds of transportation that increased there, we still fundamentally built our places around that same transportation pattern. And this really was a change. This suburban experiment was a big thing where we didn't know what was going to happen, where we threw out a lot of the knowledge we had and just started building things in a really radically different way. And so what Strong Towns did is that said, at the same time that we're seeing this development pattern, we also started to see some cities really struggling around, 20, 30 years later around their finances, of not being able to figure out how to pave all the streets, of not figuring out how to be able to provide all the city services, of not really having the resource they needed. And what we said was, well, let's look at this development pattern and figure out if there's a link here. Let's actually do the math and find out how this actually checks out. So we did it. We started actually with the street where our founder lived at the time. This is a dead end rural street here. And at the time, the goal was, what they said was, look, we'd like to be annexed into the city. And what we'll do is, is have you come in, and we'll pay for half of a new road, and the city can pay for the other half. And then, our tax dollars will help pay for that road going on into the future. So we said, well, what would happen in this scenario? Well, the cost per property of doing this road improvement would cost $66,000 per property, with 50% of it assessed. And it would take 37 years for that other half to actually be recouped by public contribution from the adjoining tax base. So that means it would take 37 years of that property taxes to actually pay for that half of the road. And by the time you look 37 years out, the road actually is going to have to be replaced again, right? So we're not even going to get to the point where we can actually pay for that road going forward, right? This is actually going to create a deficit in that city's finances right there. This is going to actually go down, and that's all of the property tax. So we're not even counting fire, police, parks, anything else in that. Okay, let's look at this one. This is another little chart here, and this is a cul-de-sac here, right? We always like to look at closed loop systems, so you can actually look at the full systems. And in this system, a developer came to a city and they said, look, we will give you this development. We're going to build all the infrastructure to begin. So we'll put in all the lights, we'll put in all the pipes, we'll put in all the roads, we'll put in everything here. We'll give it to you for free. Great. You're going to get all of this tax base. That's going to pay for all this and help pay for other things here too. So what actually happened here? Well, the total cost for that road maintenance, so this doesn't include the pipes, this doesn't include the fire hydrants, this doesn't include the lights, right? But just for the road alone would cost $354,000. It would take 79 years to recoup the public expense from the tax base for this project. And to break even would require a 46% increase in property tax rates, right? Which I don't think anybody's in a position to be able to handle right now. But that's the kind of idea of what it would take to actually make this project actually cover the cost of the infrastructure, to not have it just, you're just never going to get there in 79 years. You have to replace that road a couple times in that time period. Now, when we show these charts to people, oftentimes they'll say, okay, we get that we lose money on residential, but we're going to make it up on commercial space, right? So this is an industrial park development. And it's actually right next door to another industrial park development that worked great. They did some public financing. They took a look at it. It got filled up all the way up with businesses. It was lively. Things were going on. So they said, great, let's do it again. So how did that actually pencil out? Well, they put 2.1 million into making it happen is what that was going to cost. That was going to induce 6.6 million in improvements, which is great. But the payback from that, if current conditions happens in 29 years, right? So this is assuming that it gets fully done on day one. It's all the way built out on day one. It would take 29 years for if all the revenue was devoted only to the debt, right? So it doesn't replace the infrastructure, it doesn't do anything else. You don't have any money in the bank. In 29 years, it actually takes for that project to actually repay the public dollars that went into it. When we look at the property tax on it. Here's what some of these, if you look like those cul-de-sac projects, look at one of these projects, here's what that kind of looks like. If we took all the money from it every year and stuck it in the bank for one of these roads that need to be built, right? So you stick it in the bank every year and you can see it going up and up and up over time. We're saving up money, everything's looking good. And then we get to year 25 when the road has to be replaced and suddenly we're in the hole, right? So that's not great. And obviously that's not going to work out to do it that way. But what our cities do, right, is they don't just have one of these projects. We have bunches of these projects. And here's what it looks like if every year you build that first residential development, and then you build another one, and then you build another one, and then another one, right? This is slow, steady growth. This is the kind of growth that we dream about, where it's not all in these giant booms like your experience, but actually happening slowly over a period of 25 years, you're seeing slow and steady growth. And what happens here is each year we build and we get another one, and we're going up and we're up. And by the time it becomes time due for that one payment to go down, we just still this little dip here, right? We can actually afford it because we have enough money. We had that slow and steady growth. And so we can afford the cost when it comes together. But the problem is, if you're losing money on every transaction, you can't make it up in volume, right? This is what that looks like if you extend it out throughout a whole life cycle here. And this is where a lot of our cities are now, is they've gone through this growth Ponzi scheme here over the last 50 years, and they've now found themselves in financial trouble. You're probably a lot earlier in this process because you're about to see this big boom in growth here, right? But this is the long-term trend here, where actually we end up in a lot of trouble. Now, when I show this chart, a lot of people can see it as really judgy. And I don't think we should be actually harsh judgment on the people who actually saw this process, because this is a very normal, like, human phenomenon and like human reaction, right? This is me during the pandemic, where I go, boy, I really ought to get out and exercise, but it's easier just to sit around the house and just sort of hang out and watch TV. And oh no, obesity, I'm gaining weight. This is like smoking. Oh, look, it's great. Isn't this feel great? Oh no, lung cancer, right? This is just this very normal human thing where we have short-term gains and long-term costs, where we make this mistake, where we see the early reward and we just think about this and we don't think about what it's going to cost us down the line, right? And that's how we ended up in this position in a lot of our country, where we're having a lot of struggles to actually pay for infrastructure in a lot of places, and our cities are really having trouble being able to actually like keep afloat, right? Because in this early section is so deceitful because things are looking so good. We have impact fees coming in, we have more money, we have new roads, and then those roads get to a life cycle a little way out and things really fall apart, and we end up having this whole system we can't afford that doesn't work. So there are pretty serious implications for the future with this type of growth pattern. One is the mechanisms of growth we have become accustomed to are waning. You may see some of the last gasps of this growth pattern in your community, but across the country, more and more people are seeing that they just can't keep growing this way. It's causing them trouble. Some are continuing to grow this way, and it's making them more and more in debt and more unable to fix their roads. Local governments are going to be forced to absorb the local costs of the current development pattern, right? We may see another stimulus bill. We can talk about that later from government, but more and more we're going to see the federal government not have the resources to go out and pump that money into communities across the country. Ultimately, local governments are going to have to figure out how to do with this. And this can't be done. Local governments can't absorb this cost without having large tax increases or large cuts in services, right? If we continue this pattern of growth. And that's the real key word here, in the current pattern of growth, in this current pattern of development, we can't do it without large tax increases or large cuts in services, neither of which sounds very pleasant, I think, to most of us. So what do we do in this situation where we have this pattern of growth that we can't afford and this causing us problems? Well, one idea that I came up with that we could do is we could go down to City Hall and we could take all the money out of the bank, right? Take everything out, withdraw everything. And I guess you could drive up to Bozeman, jump on a plane, head to Vegas, and we could just bet it all on black. And we could just say, great, we're just going to take all the money out of the city account and we're just going to bet it. Now, usually when I tell this to people, people generally don't think this is a good idea, except there's always one guy who does. It's always a guy, I don't know why, who's like, actually, woohoo, that sounds like fun, let's go do it. But generally people understand this is not a good financial strategy for your city to go take all the money out and go bet it. And yet, over and over again, we see cities do this with mega projects, where they have this idea, they say, we're going to build a blank thing and people are going to show up, or we're going to build blank thing that's going to fix our city's finances. And while Build It and Make It Will Come is a great plot for a movie, it's really a lousy strategy of how you're going to actually grow as a community, right? And a financial development strategy. Okay, we've talked a lot about, so that doesn't work. So what does work? And I'm going to take you back to Brainerd and to the edge of Brainerd's downtown, right? And there's been a lot of conversation of you about this new suburban experiment versus your traditional downtown. And I think some of these numbers are going to be both interesting, informative, and perhaps helpful to those of you who are trying to explain why you want to do infill and why you want to grow in town. So let's look at it. Here we have the old and blighted block, and we have the shiny and new block. So what are these? The old and blighted block is that old traditional development pattern in its absolute worst shape. It's been here for 50, 60 years. Not much has been done to it. You can see it sort of, some signs are pilling. There's sort of a mess out here. The sidewalks coming down. We've got some shops in here, but sort of a hodgepodge. And here we have right next door to it, 2 blocks over, we have a shiny new Taco John's drive-through restaurant, lots of parking. This was a development the city was thrilled about. Look, us environmental advocates, we got this lovely swale here to take care of runoff water here. We got this brand new sidewalk to help people walk around, right? We have all these things. So what are these things actually producing in terms of tax base? How are they actually doing? So the old blighted block in its worst possible condition in that pattern is producing $1.1 million of valuation. And that new and shiny block is producing $618,000. Same amount of wattage, same amount of space, but almost twice as much more value in that old blighted block. And here's the other thing. This Taco John's is at its highest use it's going to be at. This is the peak. This is peak Taco John's. This is as valuable as Taco John's is ever going to be, right? As it falls apart and deteriorates, it can actually become worth less and less money. Meanwhile, this block over here, right? This is at its lowest value. It's still actually outperforming. And here's the other thing. If we want to improve the value of these places, let's think about that old block there, what we could do with it. We could add paint to those buildings. We could add some benches. We could redo the facades. We could actually rebuild one of these spots, right? It's more built in a modular way, so you could actually build a second floor on some of these places or have one come out and like rebuild. On Taco John's, if you're not going to change the development pattern, there's not much we can do to actually improve the value of that lot without just completely redeveloping it, right? It's not built for improvement. It's not built for increased valuation. It really is set at its cap on day one. If you're not going to do it, unless you're going to like really change the development pattern and start building on that parking lot or something, which wouldn't work with the Taco John's business model, right? Okay, so there's one example, and we said let's look at some of these other things here of how these things pan out here. So here is a big box store on the edge of downtown Brainerd, and here's Brainerd's downtown. And let's look at the values of these things. Same. So just looking acre per acre here. So this is doing 0.6 million, right? So about $500,000, a little over $500,000 per an acre. And downtown is at that 1.1 million per an acre. Now, look, different places are gonna have different valuations of land, but it's pretty remarkable that you're seeing that same ratio that we saw with that Taco John's here too, right? And this downtown again, this is at its peak performance. And downtown, look at it. There's these parking lots, there's these infill opportunities here. There's all these ways that we could keep actually increasing the value of this old traditional development pattern to actually make it worth more. And this is at its peak. We know what happens to this. Over time, it goes less and less. Eventually, the big box store moves out of it. It becomes some sort of fast, somebody moves in and sells big equipment out of it for a while, and then it runs down, eventually gets redeveloped. Over here in our downtown, there are all these opportunities for improvement and to keep like building up and just incremental work and build from a value that's actually low relative to the potential here, whereas this is maxing out what's possible here, right? Here's a Kmart and a Walmart. At 967,000 per acres, but they cannot compete with String and Springer Club, which is a downtown. These are in other cities around the country, but at $5 million per an acre. And my favorite, Jimmy's Pizza Restaurant at $3.4 million per an acre, right? So it's not taking up all that space, but that's how much it's actually producing per an acre. It's crazy, right? So like when we think about this and like what we have to do to be prosperous as places, we just have to be innovative enough to be able to create Jimmy's Pizza Houses and do that old traditional development pattern. And that is something that we can do, right? We can figure this out. So that's the revenue side of it. Let's look also at the cost side of this development pattern. So this is a city, Lafayette, but we saw the same thing happen all over the country. And they experienced this population growth, dramatic population growth between 1949 and 2015, where they went from 33,000 people to 121,000, a 3.5 times the growth pattern, population size, pardon me. So what happened there? Well, they had more pipe for a feet. They went from 5 feet of pipe per person to 50 feet of pipe per person. So 10 times. Their population only grew by 3.5 times, but the amount of pipe that they need per person grew 10 times. For fire hydrants per person, for 1,000 people, they went from 2.4 to 51.3, over 21 times as much, right? Fire hydrants, right? So when you do all of this, you're needing a lot more infrastructure. And meanwhile, the household income's only growing by 1.6 times as much, right? So you're not seeing radically more amounts of money here, but you're seeing radical more costs go up here. And what happened essentially is we used to build in this way where when people were building our communities, right, and early in those neighborhoods, what did they do? They built in this old traditional way where you said like, okay, if I'm gonna have to have infrastructure in front of my house, I want it to be as little possible infrastructure as possible. So I'm gonna build my house on a skinny lot where it goes backwards in this way, where I'm really like using up as little frontage as possible so that I have as many neighbors as I can help me pay for my road and help pay for the pipes that need to go and help pay for this infrastructure and help pay for everything else. And what we did in the suburban model, we just flipped it sideways and took up a bunch more space, a frontage especially, right? And we can talk about what these look like on in-lots or what these look like in downtowns, et cetera, and how this pencils out here. But these suburban lots took up a bunch more space, took up a bunch more infrastructure, and had less people to actually cover those same amount of spaces here. So what does this mean in terms of as we think about growth? Again, and what this looks like. I've given some hints along the way, but I'm going to jump back here. Here's an old frontier town. This could be Sandpoint, where I'm from. This could be your town. This could be This could be Seattle, honestly. This could be Boise. This could be Bozeman. It happens to be Brainerd, right? But this is how our town started. People just started building up things. They started incrementally. They started building what they could, and over time, for a set of reasons we don't totally understand, some of those places grow and incrementally grow up. That's that same street years later. And years later, the street grew up again, and it became this, right? And that's what happened in your downtown, in your city. It slowly incrementally over time, it built up, right? The railroad came in, things started getting built. This is a Sandpoint story. I know you're a railroad town as well as we are. I think it might be the same line. They built these cities. People started to build around that railroad, and slowly over time, things grew up around it. And that's what we're proposing is the way that we actually build our towns in this slow, incremental way. And that when we have growth, we want to funnel it into ways that actually reinforce that pattern of growth, that historic pattern of growth, that keep building in that historic way. To do this, we really have a process of public investment that we talk about, of how you should think about where to focus public investment. We can also talk about what that means for like zoning maps and comprehensive plans here too a bit. What does that mean in terms of zoning here? In terms of public investment. So here's what we say. What we need to be doing, instead of trying to come up with big major projects or everything else, is humbly observe where people in the community struggle and ask the question, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? How do we help people deal with those challenges right now? And then do that thing, do it right now, and repeat. When we think about growth in this context of a strong town public investment project or process, instead of thinking about, right, when we experience growth like you are right now, instead of thinking about how are we going to handle all this growth, I think the question is, and where are we going to like go set it aside, and where are we going to go put it on the edge of town, or where are we going to go put it somewhere else? The question is how can that growth help us solve the challenges that we face? How can that growth help build a stronger downtown? How can that growth help us build a stronger community? How can we make sure that as we're building things, we're not just creating new problems in our community, new traffic challenges, new issues, new crises, but how is that growth going to actually funnel into places where that revenue actually helps us address our problems, helps us fix sidewalks, helps us build parks, helps us actually have a tight community, helps us build communities where we know our neighbors? How are we going to build in that kind of way? And how is it going to make it so the places where we already live are better and stronger, and not just more stuff, not just like more expanded outward, but how is it actually reinforcing who we are and who we want to be, and reinforcing the character of who we want to be, and how we approach it. A couple thoughts here that I'll just note, and we can talk more about this, but I think one of the things to be really conscious of as growth is coming in is one of our rules is this idea that no community should have to be the sole, with the exception of downtowns, which tend to like just love the growth and there's not as much challenge there. When we talk about like housing increases and stuff, no one part of town should have to absorb all of that growth, and no one should have to experience like radical change, but also no one should expect to have their community like frozen in place. Incremental change should be able to happen across the entire community. So if you have a single family neighborhood, they're not going to see a 5-story apartment popped up next to them, but they are going to see like accessory dwelling units come in, where you see some gentle increase in density there, right? How do we make it so that everyone in our community is sharing what happens here, and sharing that obligation and that experience of change, but experiencing it in a gentle way, rather than suddenly seeing these giant buildings pop up right next to you. But instead, how does that happen in a way that's across the community? Okay. I'm going to take a quick 10 minutes here, and then we'll jump to questions, just to talk on a little thing I do about planning in general. And these are just some tips. I know you're thinking about planning right now, and just some tips on how to make an effective plan. This is not going to get so much into some of the strong town financial stuff we did. There's a little pivot here, but I just thought this stuff's fun and useful, as you can tell from my slide that includes Harrison Ford, hobbits, and how-tos. Those are the 3 things I promise you in the next 10 minutes here. Are some additional how-tos, some hobbits, and Harrison Ford. And we will start with Harrison Ford. How plans go wrong. There are 2 big ways that I see plans go wrong. The first is that people make these grand, dramatic plans, and they set them on a shelf, never to be used or seen again. That's not particularly helpful, right? I think you have this big comprehensive plan, no one ever uses it, no one ever sees it, it has no purpose, not particularly helpful. The other thing we see, though, is people use the strategic plan or the comprehensive plan, and it opens up. This is a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's not going to go well for these gentlemen in a second here. There's going to be some face melting going on as they try to enact this plan, because they had this big, grand vision, and they try to do it. And that big, grand vision ends up actually making things worse rather than making it better. So we want to think about, instead of grand plans versus humble steps, right? Of where are we going to go? Instead of having this big vision of how we're going to transform everything, how can we make some humble steps that improve our place, right? This is some more Harrison Ford here, right? The Lost Grail here. It's not the big shiny thing that's just transformative. Instead, it's that cup of a carpenter, that wooden cup there, these humble things that help us improve who we are, that build on those things, and are not about massive transformations, but about that humble, slow, and steady growth and funneling things into who we are and how we want to do things. I stick this in this presentation. We just ran through this. We can talk about it more later. I'm obsessed with it. The other thing is having plans that are more compasses than maps, that speak to community values to help people know how to make decisions. Things seem to change rapidly. We're seeing a big boom of growth today. We may see a growth that we may see that actually recede. We may see that after the post-pandemic, people may start going back to cities. We don't know exactly what's going to happen and what those patterns are going to happen there. Some humility there. A big way that I see cities and small towns especially go wrong with this is they create a map where they're like, in 30 years, we're going to need developments out on the edge of town, and we're going to change this space over to commercial on the edge of town. And so what they do is they start decentralizing. So on day one of the plan, if the plan says 30 years from now, we're going to need something on the edge of town, they start okaying that development there. Or they say, oh, we're going to need expansion of commercial. So they start okaying commercial spaces, even though their downtown actually still has all this empty space in it, right? So this is an example of the compass versus the map, is you don't want your maps to start like propelling you for, literal maps in this case, right? To start having you like open up all these areas for development before you've actually reached the point where you need it. You want to focus that development inward in ways that strengthen the way we've talked about, and not immediately have people on day one building development that may be appropriate in 30 years if everything happens the way that we predict it, but could also be totally the wrong thing to do. Like there's a little like, know where you want to head, but don't just try to jump there really quickly. Leave room for that unpredictability. This, I think, is really important. For legal reasons, most states, including Montana, I believe, have pretty significant requirements about all the stuff you have to put in these big plans. And so people end up with these really big documents with appendices and all this other stuff and all this stuff in them. And one of the lessons that I like to tell people is the more people that need to use a plan, the shorter it needs to be. Right? Let me say that again. The more people that need to use a plan, the shorter it needs to be, because you need more people to understand it and be able to buy into it and utilize it. And so something I really want to encourage and for you to all advocate for is really on one page or a couple pages, the key plan should exist. Maybe that's a set of action steps. They're just put in a table in some way where people can go through it, but something that people in your community can all rally behind and understand, so that somebody who's a small business owner doesn't have to read through 50 or 60 or 70 pages to understand what's going to happen or what we're going to do over the next like 20 years and what our strategy is, but can actually look at a single piece of paper or maybe 2 or 3 papers, right? The shorter the better, though. Really, if you can get it down to one page front and back, you're going to be in so much better shape here. So it's understandable and digestible. You can get real comments, because it's impossible to get real public input on 70-page documents. You can pull out some things here and there, but what we need to know is like, what's this really about and where are we trying to go to? And this can be the manual on how to accomplish that thing, right? Which matters, but what are the big top lines of what we're going to do together? The other thing is start with who, not what or how. Who do we serve in our community? How are we trying to support the people in our community? We often talk a lot about like buildings and development and growth in these conversations. And we talk about like, oh, what's going to go where and how that's going to happen. And we skip over who we're trying to serve, right? The point of growth is not just the economic balance sheet of a city. The point of growth is to serve the people who live in the city. It's important for those people that the city have a strong balance sheet so it can continue to provide services. But how are we creating places for us? How are we creating places for people who live there? That's the core question. And so it's just really important that we come back to that question and not get caught up in those other questions there. And part of that is not thinking of citizens. I've heard this recently, of this idea of when we think about the people who live our places, this idea of customers. It's this new business model where, oh, all of our citizens and our residents are customers, and how we're going to make better customer service. And that is such a destructive practice because it doesn't think of the people who live there as having agency. It makes us think of government as a spectator sport. You're outside of it, and people just need to we're just going to provide things to you. And instead, we want to think of the citizens and people who live places as co-creators, as people who have the potential to actually help create their place. And we can talk about some specific examples of how that plays out if useful in the Q&A, or what that actually means. Okay. So the final summary is, so those were some ideas there. Those are my light how-tos. I could go into more detail when we get to Q&A here, but I want to leave a lot of time for that. Bottom line is we need more hobbits. And why do I say we need more hobbits? Because hobbits are humble creatures who built their place over time slowly and focused on not how could they make a lot of profit or how could they build big dreams, but they thought, how could they build deep community? How can they make sure that what they're building and what they're doing together actually create stronger connection with each other? These are mystical creatures from Lord of the Rings, in case I update one anyway. But they like to have like lots of meals, and they like to spend lots of time together, and they're just a rural community where people are connected to each other and where family and community are central, and connection across difference, right? And that's the challenge we face as we build our places, is how do we create more hobbits rather than these grand visionaries who are going to create places that are fundamentally different. But rather, we don't need that. What we need is people who are going to help us have a vision of how we enhance who we are and build more of who we are and strengthen those community and those ties as we experience growth, and make the right choice about growth and the right choices. And instead of having growth, have something that takes things away from us, that makes us poorer, that drives our communities into debt. Have growth be something that tightens our bonds with each other, that helps rebuild our downtowns and makes them stronger, that strengthens our local businesses, that builds stronger neighborhoods where we have deeper connections to each other, where we're able to walk around and interact with each other, strengthens our finances so we can last for the next 20 and 50 and 100 years, and really build places for us to live together. So that's what I wanted to share with you all today. And I am happy to talk a little bit more with you all and to have some dialogue here now.
Thank you so much, John, for your excellent presentation. It was perfect and very timely for our community, so thank you. So we've got a good amount of time, and I'm grateful for that. The way we've done this in the past is ask folks to put questions in the chat or raise their hand. I would prefer for folks to go ahead and unmute themselves and ask a question if you've got one. And we'll try to call on folks. I don't see anything in the chat right now.
So I had a question.
Go ahead, Daniela.
So I'm wondering about the railroad, like industry, the trains, the property that it uses. Someone made a good point about all that space that used to be used that I'm not sure is being used now for the train station. And I know there's a lot of pollution that's happened because of the trains. And so I haven't heard too much about what everyone's thinking about how to go about that, to take care of it and to use that to our ability in town.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to these things, but it should be noted, right? I think context matters, and so where the location of that is, and I'm sorry, I don't know your town well enough to know exactly where it's located or how adjacent it is, whether it's more already rural edge of town or whether it's sort of central to town, and how it connects with your downtown. So I just want to give that preamble there. But oftentimes with railroads, you can have it's possible you may need to do some work, to do some pre-work to make it safe for redevelopment, right? There may be some work there. I think that kind of stuff, we're generally suspicious of federal additional money that's often used for infrastructure, because it just ends up building all these roads that you can't afford later, right? A big highway going through the middle of your town or a road widening project ultimately leads to roads you have to maintain. But a great use for federal stimulus money and a great use for grant money is things that actually like make a site reusable, right? So like in Ponderay, which is a small town, about 2,000 people, the border standpoint, they've actually gotten a lot of resources to help them figure out how are they going to actually utilize some property that runs alongside train tracks there. It's not so much the issue there is a lot more around some of the industrial uses that were on the lake there. So again, I don't know exactly what the adjacent industrial uses that were connected to train travel. So I don't know what the industrial uses were connected to your particular the train traffic in your community. But I think those kind of things are smart uses. And as we're looking at moments where people are talking about stimulus or the state's looking at advocacy there, I think that often can make sense, because then you can actually build incrementally on top of that to get those sites ready for development and then build in that incremental way. How you do that is very, it's challenging, and oftentimes the cost of getting those sites ready for development can be prohibitive to a small town. So I think that that can be very, very challenging. I hope that that's helpful, and I expect that you can all have a more vibrant conversation in your community around that question too. And
Yeah, and I just want to say, John, thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing. And I really agree about building up instead of building out, and focusing on our downtown and the ways we could use it for the people who are here all year round instead of just temporary. But just want to say thank you, and that did help.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, John. I see Chris King has a question. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, I did talk text and misspelled. I am really interested in some other communities, the effective incentives they've had to do infill and affordable housing. When I'm talking to local businesses, that's their primary issue. I mean, besides the pandemic, for survival, is having affordable housing for their staff. And so I'm wondering how we can have there be leverage so that that's more likely instead of just a value, but incentives. Thank you.
yes, so the biggest incentive that you can do for affordable infill housing is to make it really easy to build, is to be really specific. What catches these projects up and like can dramatically increase the cost of them is having, and I'll speak a little bit more about what I mean here, but having processes that require a board approval, that make it uncertain, that make it more challenging, right? So I would say, one, there's that piece of it. Is just, can you actually create smooth and simple and direct processes that you should, I think the standards can be high, but the standards need to be clear and objective so a developer knows what they're doing and how they get there. I think other models that are interesting, I mean, I think there's things that you can do, but I'm not sure that I think there's ways that you can waive fees and other sorts of things, but I tend to think that those don't actually necessarily, I think those make it a little easier, but they're not really significant enough, particularly compared to some of what exists for affordable housing at other levels of government and the encouragement to happen there. What I would, and I don't actually think all this policies actually end up there, I think I would suggest is thinking about affordable housing and infill housing as not necessarily being big projects built by developers, right? Oftentimes people, I see this in your question, kind of like pushing back on the notion. Oftentimes people think that it's not infill. They think it's like, oh, we're gonna build a big apartment building, or we're gonna build this building development, that's gonna be all of affordable housing. And so one of the things that I would say is it can often be these like accessory dwelling units. And what that means is like the ability to convert a garage into housing, the ability to build a second floor and convert it over there, right? How can we allow people to convert a house into a duplex? Just really gentle increases in density. So like, yes, it is a little bit build up, not out, but I think oftentimes it gets people picturing these big giant buildings in their head or downtowns in their head. And what we're really talking about is just like that soft fabric that makes it so that somebody's mother can move in next to them. It's so somebody's kids can come back home again and have somewhere to stay, or that there's a little bit of room there. It's so that someone can rent something out that actually gives them an extra set of income, right? I'm just gonna, okay, here's what I'm gonna, I'm just gonna share screen here again here. And this is the part we talked about which parts to do here. And I went short enough that I can actually now cheat here and do some more stuff with you here. We have a pandemic response guide, which you can go find online. But one of the things we talk about in all this thing, right? I talk about this, here's where you can find it, by the way. Very easy, strongtowns.org/toolkit. Okay, so what are we saying here? Okay, what do? Lower the bar to entry, right? Back in the day when we built these towns, it was really easy to build stuff. So how do you make it easier, right? It used to be when you had a small, like, let people build smaller houses. Let people be able to build on. It used to be like when you had a house and you got a hole in your roof and you were trying to figure out what to do, you couldn't afford to do it. So you'd actually build an ADU onto your house and be able to like build outward there, right? So how do we give people those options to like incrementally expand it? Same thing with like businesses. How do we create small opportunities for new businesses to get started in our town? This used to just be a parking lot. They put all these things in here, right? It's lowering that bar of entry to let things get in there. Those are some like solid examples there. I hope that's, I don't know if I actually added much by showing those slides there, but it helped me remember what I wanted to say. So that's what I would say is how can you lower that bar and how can you get there? Hopefully that's a helpful beginning there, but affordable housing is one of the biggest, one of the most challenging like problems in the crux. And I would just say the biggest advantage you have is your housing isn't that expensive yet. I mean, it's much more expensive than it used to be, but it's going to be even more expensive 10 years from now, likely.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that link, John. I'm glad we got that in there. So we got some more questions here. Kimball, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question? And then I see Jesse Wilcox and Jess Haas. So just so you guys know, you're in the queue. Go ahead, Kimball.
Not sure I know how to.
We can hear you. You're great. Go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, I am.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, this is my opinion. To begin with, we seem to have a very top-down approach to our growth plan and most other matters to do with our town. How do we change that to the model you suggest, where the views of the community members are primary, important, and we know that they're included in the growth plans and other steps to the future in our town?
Great question. And I'm going to give you two different answers to it. And it sort of depends on this. So first, what you're doing, I heard 60 people showed up and made comments, right? Ask for processes that allow for president. So if we think the challenge is that elected leaders or boards and commissions just don't think that the people should have a voice, which could be the problem, then it's really about insisting on it and figuring out how to have those conversations. And I would say one of the things that I would do to make it happen initially is to push intimacy, right? Like normally I'd say like in a small town, you'd like to go have coffee with somebody, but in this case, you can't do that. So I would say like, let's get, or maybe you can, I don't know where you're at in your lockdown right now, but having a Zoom call with people or sitting down together. I'm in Seattle, right? So we're in the epicenter here. So we're particularly paranoid about all contact. So I think it may be a little different in rural Montana right now, just to note that, just to explain the different levels of precaution. So having coffee together, having a conversation. I wrote a thing a while back on parking requirements. One of the first things we say people should do is eliminate parking minimums. We think is one of the great things you can do, which is also great, by the way, for making more affordable housing. So I should have added that one as one of the ways to do it. It also helps like people be able to build it downtown. It is, I would eliminate them everywhere. There's no need for them. That asks this question of persuasion, and it sort of walks through in that article. And Michelle can, our Michelle can talk to your Michelle or Jennifer, and we can get you a copy of that article that walks through how you do that. Okay. So if you know what to do, though, if you have a city and they're just like, we want to listen to people, we just don't know how, then I would say that the strategy there is to really change the way that you're doing public engagement and to stop just thinking you're going to do it through these public formats or these public comment periods and actually start trying to look and see what people are experimenting or people are experiencing. What that means is actually interviewing people, going out and finding the people you serve and actually sitting down and talking to them. It could be observing where people are walking or where people are doing things. It could be just trying to start observing what's actually happening in the community and taking some responsibility for doing it. We often have an exercise around transportation where we say, okay, if you don't have a car, which can be a reality, even in rural communities for more people than we think, how would you get from this place to your job over here? And start to think about those problems and how can we solve them? If I was a kid and I wanted to walk to school, how would I actually get there? Right? And as elected officials, as boards, start to actually try to do those things. If you're elected officials and your boards won't do it, community members can do those things too. And I'm sorry, I'm giving a very abbreviated version of a longer talk I give about exactly this question of how do you actually do public input and how do you actually do better public input. But it really all revolves around getting out of public meetings and not thinking of public meetings as the only place to get comments and do everything with stars and dots, to actually having deeper, more immersive conversations with the people who live places. And there's all sorts of tactics that can be used for that. So that's the beginning of an answer. And I'm sorry, it's not as deep as I would love to give, but some resources and some initial suggestions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I just want to remind folks that we can visit your website and you've got a lot of resources there so we can follow up. We only have, I guess, 4 more minutes now. So I want to make sure that at least we get to Jesse's question. And I want to remind everybody that there is a planning board public hearing tonight at 5:30. And we sent out an email with a link to that. I think Jonathan's going to drop it in the chat. And I also want to just acknowledge that we really do have a very engaged community and a lot of board members and city commissioners and staff that are all joining us here today, which is really a gift for our community. So with that, Jessie, do you want to ask your question? Jessie serves on the planning board and she's got a question about the longevity of the plan. Go ahead, Jessie.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And John, thank you so much. I feel like you might have been like hanging out in our town for the last 2 months because I feel like you touched on so many things that we're dealing with right now. So great presentation. One thing I keep hearing more and more about our current growth policy draft is it is really a 20-year plan. And that's why, similar to what you were talking about when you referenced the compass versus the map, we have these maps expanding way out into our county with, planned future growth. Is that true that these growth policies have to be 20-year plans and that we should be looking that far ahead? Because our document is also 355 pages long. And I wonder how we change that, or I wonder if that is mandated. I know we're supposed to update or review this growth policy every 5 years. And to me, that seems like a much more realistic time frame to be developing a growth policy. But again, I keep hearing it's a 20-year plan. So this is why we have to have all of this information in it.
So it probably is mandated by the state. I don't know Montana law well enough. In Idaho, that would be true. And Montana actually has stronger growth provisions, and it's often seen as a positive to have those long-term horizons and to force you to think long-term for those reasons. But I would say, well, not even but, here's what I would say. It is better to be conservative about growth boundaries than to be permissive in growth boundaries. Meaning, I would say, people often say, well, we want to plan for the biggest population growth, but that can lead to really poor decisions about where you allow things to set. There's not a lot of damage by pushing growth inward, whereas there can be a lot of damage by allowing growth outward. Because if you have the growth outward before you're ready for it, like the footprint of the town may expand over the next 30 years or 20 years. I don't think any of us know for sure. We did not see as much population. We were experiencing a boom in Sandpoint, similar to what you're experiencing now. The town did not grow as much as people thought it was going to be. It ended up on the lower side of the projections rather than the higher side of the projections when we did our plan in 2008. So that's 12 years ago now. We have not we're a little over halfway through that plan, and we did not see the growth that we anticipated, and we were in a very similar moment in time. So that would be but you may. Results are going to vary. I would just say in 5 years, you can update it, is what I would tell people who say, like, well, we have to have it all the way out here. I'd be like, no. Let's be conservative about what we think is going to happen in 20 years. And let's focus the growth where we want it to. And then also let's make sure that we're really clear. Just because something I would like put this explicitly in the plan. We are going to be conservative in expanding our growth boundaries and where we grow. We are not going to quickly go out to it. We are going to do it slowly and surely, not fast. And so I would just make that explicit policy. There's some other explicit policies I would do too in the plan. Okay, I'm just going to run through some explicit policies. I have a few minutes that I can hang out, Michelle. So if you don't need to cut me off at the end here, and if people need to go, I understand. But I have a few minutes. So I just have a chance to run through stuff, and I can take the last question here too.
Okay, great. Thanks, John.
Is that okay? Great.
Yep.
So here's a few things I would do. Yep. Okay. Great. If we need to, been great seeing you all. Thank you all for coming. I want to make sure that I'm helping answer your questions here. And this will be we've now answered John Reuter's hanging out after the talk and chatting with some people time. And it's with all of you, that's great. Okay. So this is John Reuter hanging out after the chat. I'm gonna casual up here a little bit, get all relaxed. Okay. So now it's just us and all those other people who weren't as deeply invested have left. What are some tips that I might make for your plan casually here at the end here? I would lower the transportation service goal. Oftentimes transportation service goals, particularly goals of having them be lead to widening of streets unnecessarily. So I would reduce widening of streets pretty dramatically and say we're willing to accept traffic going slower, the level of service, we don't need a highest level of service. We're willing to accept actually a pretty low level of service because levels of service are based on peak traffic that often is never realized. And they're often based on peak traffic 20 years from now. So they get really crazy. They can lead you widening streets that you don't actually need widened. So that's one. I would be conservative on impact fees. Impact fees, we think we're going to take all this money from developers, right? So as we're thinking about these things, which is great if we're asking them to give us money for things we actually want. But oftentimes those impact fees ask for all these wish lists of projects that actually aren't things we really need. They're street widenings, they're new things here, they're all this additional infrastructure that isn't even related, that's related to that infrastructure, but actually is not infrastructure that the new development won't pay for 20 years in the future. It also increases the cost of affordable housing. Oftentimes those impact fees can be just as high in downtown where we want them to happen as on the edge of town where we don't want it to happen, right? So that's another thing I would do. I would say push for a structure that's very permissive of what you do want and very tough on things you don't want. So how do we make it so people can build things by right that we do want and not build things that we don't want, right? So it's really easy if you're a developer coming in to build new affordable housing, we should make that we want the kind of style that we want in places that we want it in this incremental way that we talked about or in our downtown. Let's make that as easy as possible. Let's make it really easy to build commercial downtown and not as easy necessarily to build that same project somewhere else in town, right? Which heightens that and pushes that development inward. And let's be really slow about growing the footprint of commercial too. Decentralizing commercial harms downtowns, right? There's this old Yogi Berra quote, right? Nobody goes there anymore because it's too busy. That's such a silly thing. And I have this little thing I give on parking sometimes where we talk about how parking is, people say, what's place? And people think, oh, place is downtown. And wilderness is not place. And it's like, no, those of us who live in the West, we know the mountains are place too, right? What the opposite of place is parking. It's just this abyss of nothing happening. And so parking is your real enemy here. And how do you actually fill that parking up with stuff like people will come downtown still if things are happening. So I know I'm talking a little rapidly here, but we're in this informal conversation piece, but I'll try to make sure I'm slowing down here a little bit. What are other things I think are important for strategic plans? Thinking about transportation. When I did my strategic planning in Sandpoint, I said that we put in a provision that could be no roads more than 3 lanes in town, which was particularly to combat some state highway stuff we were seeing. I think those kind of like things that create pressure to not do wild infrastructure are helpful. You can always change them later, right? The point is to put a directionalism there. And then also to put in some real clear things about ADUs should be allowed everywhere, parking requirements should be eliminated. Yeah, so I'm going through the same kind of stuff here. And then really pushing for there to be a simple summary to the plan. Say, I understand we need 360 pages for background. I want there to be a couple page document that citizens can read. I want basically there to be a citizen's guide to the plan. What's our 5-page version that every person in our town can read in Livingston, that everyone can read to know what's in this plan and what we're going to do? And I want that to be the document. And I want us to once a year or once a quarter come back and look at that 5-page document together and talk about how we're meeting it and how we're following that document. And so you really make it so there's an official like 20-year plan somewhere, but then you have your real plan that you're actually operating off of, which is like a 5-page plan that we all talk about all the time. And that's like the citizen guide or whatever to it. So those are some initial ideas of how you can like start to get going on this. I'm sure I have more ideas. I'm sorry that I'm just shooting from the hip here a little bit, but hopefully that helps give some starting points. Okay, we're already in overtime. Who else? We have Matthew wanted to get in the question.
Yeah, so Jess Haas has her hand raised. So go ahead.
Great.
You want to unmute and ask your
Thanks, Michelle. I think this really kind of touches in on a lot of the questions that other people have been bringing up, but in a town that has so much tourism and so many people that want to visit from out of state, it's really appealing to a lot of people to somehow create a vacation type rental within their property. Either those ADUs often get filled up, I think, with Airbnbs. And I'm just wondering, how do you balance that between being able to provide personal income from something like Airbnb, which can be really lucrative to people, versus something that's more a longer term need that the community has for affordable housing. And I see that ends up being an issue in a lot of tourist towns. So I was wondering if you've had any experience with that with Sandpoint or other towns that you've worked with to see how they balance those two kind of opposing, in my mind, it could be opposing needs. Personal
you all have
need,
great questions.
community need.
Because they're all the hard ones. This is a hard one, right? And there's not, and I don't want to say like I have not found like the silver bullet where someone got it perfectly right. We created rules around who could make rentals and not, and tried to cap them to some degree. I don't think that was totally successful because it drove some of that economy underground too. So it's very tricky because of the black market of temporary like vacation homes. Makes it really, really hard to figure out how you regulate your way out of it. I still think it's probably worth doing to some degree, but I think it's really challenging. I do think making it extra easy for owner occupied to do some rental out there, right? It's much better because then at least we're creating affordability for the person who's in the adjacent home. So like an Airbnb where you're living there versus an Airbnb where you don't live there 9 months of the year because you're fleeing, or or whatever it is better, because then at least we're helping a family in town be able to afford in town, and that can be a useful way to help create affordability for someone. I think that's a traditional way that people have created affordability in the branch of history, right? Is renting out a temporary spot. But I think it's really challenging. I've not seen anyone come up with the silver bullet to Airbnb. Those are some light ways that I would like begin to approach it. And then I think just expanding that supply, right? Like, I think the reality is that having more of them will make it so that less of them are good. There's just not going to be as big of a market for the ones that exist there. But there's so many people who want to rent those spaces. It's particularly right now in this pandemic, right? There's so many people coming in. I know that they got all filled up in Sandpoint during the pandemic. I was talking to friends there, and so there was quite a supply. It's just very, very challenging. So I'm sorry I don't have like the silver bullet for you, but I do think that those things, I think it's the things to think about working to do, and I think it's a difficult balance, particularly because of how ineffective I've seen regulation be to solve it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, John. Thank you for sticking around a little bit longer. I think you've got such excellent content. And I think I want to encourage everybody to check out your website and the book. And, I don't see any other questions here in our chat. So
I see a user named Stone waving her hand at me here.
Oh, okay. Go ahead and unmute. I didn't see that one.
Oh, it's Jerry. Love watching your baby. I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to send my question through the chat window. So hope you can hear me okay. So John, my question is, I'm envisioning downtown Livingston. I have been through Sandpoint, but I have to say I don't remember it well. I've also been through Brainerd many, many times. But I'm envisioning downtown Livingston, which looks a lot like that primary picture that you showed us when the whole program started today. So I'm thinking, is there value, or how do you go about, have you got any information you can give us about having one-way streets in the downtown section, or closing one of those streets and making it a pedestrian area only, where you've got planters and sidewalk tables and benches and so forth, so that it's more pedestrian friendly? So I just wonder if you have some comments on that.
I do have comments on this, and they're going to be a little counterintuitive. One-way streets may or may not make sense. We converted to one-way streets in Sandpoint, and then we fought for 20 years. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Am I? Yeah, great.
Yes, I'm having mixed internet issues. So
well, you can watch the recording if you can't hear me now too. But what I'll just say is, we fought for one-way streets, and then we fought against them for the next 20 years because we found out they actually weren't very helpful. There's a lot of reasons why two-way streets can be better, but that's not true in every instance. And I think if you can narrow your streets, that's helpful. If you could let people use parking, like a lot of places have during the pandemic, to open up adjacent activities or do outdoor seating, that can be helpful. Temporary street closures can be a great idea for a festival, for a weekend, for a moment, to create a sense of events. permanent street closures have usually not worked out well. There are a couple of exceptions in the country. One is in Missoula, it's well known, and maybe what folks in Montana think about. But generally speaking, closing down downtown streets and just making them pedestrian only is not a good idea, and it's had pretty bad impacts in terms of the financially, in terms of how people able to get there. But slowing the traffic on downtown streets, making them more walkable, adding areas that are just like designed so that people are being prefaced over automobiles, right, has worked out really well. So I would say it's sort of an in-between point of how are you making them more pedestrian, how are you making them profoundly more pedestrian friendly while still allowing cars to go through them is the right balance there in many of these places. And just to be really wary, the pedestrian project, while it fits more into sort of our ideological framework, is actually just another example of that, like big shiny project that seems like it's going to be a great idea, but doesn't actually work out in that way until you get to a point where there's so many pedestrians on the street that it incrementally makes sense to close. So that's sort of my thought about how those work and how to tackle them. And then if we are done with questions now, and someone should wave their hands furiously at me if we're not, I just want to leave you all with that thought, right, of that strong town system here. The real key here is, and I heard many of you even think about it now, is how are we incrementally building? What's the next step to do? How do we slowly but surely get to the vision of where we want to go? Have that compass, have the 20-year vision of what we want to build into. What are our community values? What kind of community do we want to live in? What is it going to look like downtown? But then build there piece by piece. Look at what's happening in your neighborhood. Talk to your neighbors. Don't just have meetings where they all have to show up and give sticky notes. Actually talk to each other, listen to each other. And that's how you're going to build a strong town while also doing the math and making sure that it actually pencils out. So that's the thought I want to leave you all with. I am so grateful for getting to have this conversation with all of you at the sort of key moment of where your community's at. And I just want to thank you all for caring about your place. I really believe, I think we're in a really tough place in our country right now in terms of the divides that we face, the way people are thinking rural versus urban, Democrat versus Republican, right? All these kind of ways, Californians versus everyone else, all these ways that we're divided as a country right now. And I think the way that we're going to come back together again is by people at the local scale doing the work, to actually talk to their neighbors together, to looking past those differences to figure out what we have in common, what are our shared values, and how do we keep building and strengthening the places that we share a love for. So thank you for being involved in this work. I think it's the core to us being successful as a country is what you're doing in your community, and I just really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you so much, John. Wonderful conversation. We're so thrilled that you were here with us today. And thank you everyone for joining. Should we say goodbye, Mario?